Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. In a world of the 24-hour news cycle, where people are just as likely to get their news from Facebook or Twitter as they are from CNN or Fox News, one medium that has been increasingly in decline has been the newspaper. Once the staple of every business traveler and class project, the newspaper has all but become extinct. While some newspapers have disappeared due to the new ways people consume their news, not to mention the growing lack of trust in the press, others have shifted to how they have become available, moving to a more digital format, which brings us to the New York Sun. The New York Sun was founded in 1833 and achieved many accolades, including 2 Pulitzer Prizes, before it ceased publication in 1950. During its run, the New York Sun was America's largest newspaper. To shed some light on the New York Sun's resurgence, today we welcome the publisher and chairman of the New York Sun, Dovid Efune. Mr. Efune, welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Newspapers seem to be a dying art form, and we like to try to bring that back. So when we hear about the resurgence of a particular paper, especially one as popular and as important historically as the New York Sun, I felt that this was a very important topic to bring to our listeners. So again, thank you for coming on.
You're absolutely right in terms of how you introduce this, how newspapers and the consumption of newspapers has really evolved. I mean, we are an online product still, but the concept is very different, even if it's not in print. So, you had this period for a long time where your newspaper was sort of your window to the world. It was like, your sports team. You had this reciprocal loyalty between the reader and the publisher and the newspaper and the editors and the journalists who were advocating for that public. And then, at first, when people started to consume news online, we had this decade of, let's call it, promiscuity in news consumption. But what we're seeing now, and, really, the thesis on which the return of the Sun is based, is that people are becoming tired of that. They've begun to recognize that there's so much junk out there. There are so many folks just trying to take advantage of people with clickbait and rope them in with something that's really not what it says it is, or substantive or interesting. And people have begun to get a sense that this is shallow and it's not a productive way to engage with the world around us and with the news of the day. And increasingly looking to go back to this reciprocal relationship with a publication that speaks for them, that advocates on their behalf, that addresses the concerns and the priorities that they have, and really, subscribe, become a member, see it as their sort of window to the world, join that community. So we're back as a newspaper for the people that really brings quality and value to people's lives on a regular basis. I would argue that it's a newspaper for this very moment, in exactly the way that you framed it, away from this sort of junk consumption, and into the era of, serious, valuable, thoughtful advocacy for you and your community.
So let me ask you, so why now? What in your background has led you to the resurgence of this particular paper? Because there have been others that have kind of gone by the wayside as well. So why the New York Sun, and why now? Why the resurgence now?
Well, look, you touched on this also a little bit at the beginning. It's not a secret that the environment for newspapers is really one of crisis. I mean, you have an institution, the institution of journalism and the press, that is supposed to be the catch-all, the safety net of American democracy, if you will. When all other institutions have failed, the press, it remains to advocate on behalf of the people and the American public. And we're in a situation today where not only is the press not serving that role in the large part, but it actually serves the opposite function. You have a situation where the vast majority of Americans just do not trust newspapers and the press. Trust in press has ebbed to historic lows. There was a study recently that was conducted of 90,000 people in 45 different countries, and the United States ranked at the actual bottom, the final on the list, the lowest possible in terms of trust for media, for newspapers. 54% of Americans, according to an Edelman poll, feel like journalists are deliberately trying to mislead them. So, we're re-entering the newspaper market at a time of incredible distrust, at a time of incredible disarray. And, in terms of helping solve the issue, bringing a product to the market that says to people, listen, here is something you can trust. We thought that there was a great deal of value in the New York Sun specifically, with a 200-year track record, not just of being the greatest advocate for the American public. It carries on its banner the immortal slogan, "It shines for all, for every American." Here is a newspaper that was on the right side of history at every pivotal moment. I mean, it ran its first abolitionist editorial on its fourth day in print back in September 1833, decades before emancipation. It hosted Jose Marti in 1917 and flew the flag of free Cuba over Lower Broadway. It employed the first woman in journalism. It really just has this fantastic history of serving the role of a newspaper in exactly the way the newspaper should be served, and in exactly the way that it's so massively lacking from the media climate today. It really is a newspaper for this very moment.
So you mentioned earlier that a lot of people get kind of turned off by as far as the online versions of newspapers go, they get turned off by the clickbait. So tell us about, how do you keep the New York Sun from being accused of providing clickbait so that the readers do understand that the information they're receiving is not just from a sensationalist headline to get them to come into the article, and then the article is about something completely different?
Absolutely. And I think a part of that is, recognizing, the need of quality over quantity. The journalists and editors that write for and run the New York Sun are the brightest and the best. We've interviewed some 300 folks and selected a handful of the very best from among them. We know that the strength of any newspaper is not measured in market cap or cash on hand. It's measured in the hearts and minds of journalists. I'll tell you an interesting story. There's a book that was written about the Sun in 1918 by a journalist called Frank O'Brien. It was an 85th anniversary of the Sun in those days. And it describes the Sun's newsroom. They had a big building downtown New York. And, you came into the newsroom and it kind of looked like a warehouse. It was just empty. It had a bunch of desks of the editors and journalists there. And the Sun biographer, Frank O'Brien, writes, the only adornments of the room were men and their genius. So, we brought back, really, really the same approach to newspapering and to journalism. When somebody clicks on an article, opens up an article, every single article, we want them to be impressed and exceed their expectations and not disappointed. By the time they finish that article, we want that sense to be, I learned something that was better than I expected. That was more worthwhile than I thought it would have been. I'm a better person for it. And the only way to produce that type of journalism is to employ smart, thoughtful, educated, knowledgeable folks who understand the world, who are able to package the world, who have knowledge of the unique issues that affect everyday Americans, and are able to challenge the issues of the day, to present the news of every day in a way that brings value and advocates for the reader and the American public, that educates the reader. So we have a long tradition of practicing this type of journalism. We feel that this is exactly the type of journalism that is far too absent from American journalistic life, and we're here to bring it back and bring it back better than ever.
And I'm glad you mentioned the part about wanting to truly educate the readers, because we know that a lot of the newspapers that are out there, they're almost a step above a tabloid, and they just kind of focus on the entertainment aspect and the short attention span of our readers, of the readers that are out there. But it seems that the New York Sun is targeting the longer attention spans to actually get people to become a lot more engrossed in the articles and the stories that are being written. So tell us, what type of reader does the New York Sun actually appeal to?
I think that's certainly a part of it. The Sun is really a thoughtful publication, but I think more than anything else, really, is this issue of trust. You have newspapers that are thoughtful and publish, long-form journalism, like, for example, the New York Times, that have really just lost the trust of the American public, or a large portion of the American public. And, a part of that, a big part of that, is that they seem to have lost some of the basic fundamental journalistic principles on which newspapers and journalism are supposed to stand. So, politics is obviously a part of it, and the New York Times has a very particular political angle. But the New York Times has always been, a newspaper of the left, but it hasn't always been so untrusted, if you will. And I think a big part of how a lot of that has evolved is, the primary abdication of the primary responsibility of newspapers. First among them, obviously, is serving as an advocate for the American public, fighting for the people, holding the power to account on behalf of the people. A lot of newspapers function today in a lot of ways, including the New York Times. It seems that they are looking to police the people on behalf of the powers that they favor, or the narratives that they favor. So, we look at the landscape, we see an American public that is hungry for journalism, that knows its role, that knows its place, that serves them first and foremost, and doesn't see them as tools in some political power game, which, like so many of the other newspapers, do.
Now, when it comes to some of the reasons that people would want to return to a physical newspaper, because I know a lot of people have, again, shifted to the digital formats, the online formats. So bringing out a physical newspaper again, I think, would one of the reasons that people or the appeal of a physical newspaper is almost akin to the appeal of a physical book. Because we saw when books became digitized and you could get 1,500 books on your Kindle and start sliding through the screens to flip pages. But people wanted to have that feel of the paper, the texture of the paper, and the hardness of the hardcover books and things, the heft of the book in their hands as they were actually physically turning pages. Do you think that's the same type of appeal that people are having towards newspapers?
Yeah, I think, just to be clear, the New York Sun is not yet coming back in print. We're online, and I'll tell everybody how to access it. Although we do have a lot of appreciation for the particular experience of a print publication, and we have not ruled out the possibility that we will do something in print, maybe just starting off with a weekend edition or something along those lines. But I think what you're getting to is really the consumption habit more than anything else. Is when you're sort of clicking around online, jumping from one thing to the other, looking at, shiny objects here and there, that's sort of one approach to newspaper consumption. And then, even if it's online, there's another approach where you're sort of a member of a community, you're a part of a newspaper. You can sit down and spend some time with it, either online or even on your phone or an iPad or whatever it is. It's really, how you're approaching it. Is this just entertainment for you, just to kill a little bit of time, or is this part of your daily routine and part of how you strive to become more knowledgeable and be a better participant in society? And learn how to advocate for the issues that matter to you most. So that's the sort of style and brand of consumption that we favor and that we want to bring back. We call it building community around your content. We see people, not just clicks. We see individuals, memberships, obviously that translates into subscriptions on the business side. But, from our perspective, we're not just looking at numbers on the page. We're imagining, our readers sitting with us in the room and asking them and presenting to them, information and worthwhile perspectives that are going to improve their lives, the lives of their community, and obviously what they'd like to see as the future of our country.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is publisher and chairman of the New York Sun, Dovid Efune. Now, Mr. Efune, before we go any further, I want to understand what was your motivation for the resurgence of the New York Sun? Where did your background come from? How did you get to this point to become the chairman of the New York Sun?
That's a good question. A little bit unconventional. I studied in a school a number of years ago where one of the teachers there was the son of a newspaper publisher. It was quite a famous New York newspaper that covered Jewish affairs and Middle Eastern affairs called the Allgemeiner. And that had been founded in the 1970s by a very famous journalist called Gershon Jacobson. He used to write for the New York Herald Tribune. He was very famous because he broke the story of the capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960, which was a huge world scoop. They published a special edition of the newspaper 16 hours before anybody else when he brought that scoop to the table. And the publisher at the time, a fellow called John A. Whitney, walked into his office and gave him a $10,000 in cash as a bonus, a scoop bonus. I guess in today's money, that's probably worth $100,000, or maybe last week it was $100,000. Maybe this week it's $110,000 with how inflation is going. So, he was a well-known journalist. He established a well-known newspaper. And while I was studying at this school, his youngest son was teaching there. And it was during that year that his father, the journalist, passed away. And, we ended up spending some time together, obviously at the funeral and in the morning period afterwards, talking a bit about his dad's legacy. And that sort of got me quite interested in journalism and the power of journalism. And a couple of years later, they were looking for somebody to step in and have a go at taking the reins of that newspaper, which is now back in 2008. So I spent some time building that up, and it's quite a successful publication today, really a market leader in that particular space. But in the process, got to meet all kinds of exciting fellows in the journalism space, editors and journalists, and obviously it's those discussions that start to open up new opportunities. And at the same time, the landscape really evolved and began to really understand and get a sense of just how frustrated many Americans were with the journalism products that are out there and the real need for bringing something better to the table. And once I got to know a bit of the history of the New York Sun, it really became a no-brainer. And this was really the paper that was built to deliver this on this kind of promise.
In our schools, one of the things that we try to teach our students is to become more critical thinkers. And so a lot of teachers turn to newspapers as a source of their primary source material. So how can we use the newspaper to help our students become more critical thinkers, to analyze the news with a more critical lens?
I mean, look, I think the first thing is that, it is valuable to ensure that you're reading outlets and publications that you can trust, that have that history and that track record, that, when you read them, it's clear, what the motives are and what the intentions are, and that, you can build that reciprocal loyalty and trust. But I think also you want to put a premium on those publications that are genuinely independent. The Sun wears the livery of no party, and our current editor, Seth Lipsky, has always referred to its willingness to stand apart and to review and analyze each issue on the basis of fundamental principles that have been the bedrock of the Sun, but also of American society, really since its founding. But, it's the first role of the journalist to always question, to verify, to try and think of a new approach, a new perspective, and help our readers and our audience see the world in a new and worthwhile and valuable way as a product of spending time with the publication.
How can, what the better question would be now, what is like the typical content of the New York Sun? Because as the name may imply, that is going to be focused more on whatever news is almost like a local newspaper. So it would focus primarily on New York news. But I don't think that's the case necessarily with the New York Sun. So what's the typical content and focus of the New York Sun?
The New York Sun is a national paper. It's even an international paper. It has a particular focus on politics and the arts. We've got a fantastic arts component, arts coverage. Probably the best way to think about it, in terms of the type of coverage, it's like the New York Times, only very different in terms of its worldview and perspective. But, it covers a similar scope of subjects, I'd say. And we've got very robust international coverage of national politics, the arts, as I mentioned, education. There's a lot of focus on constitutionalism and also what we call constitutional moments. Those fundamental milestones in American public life where, the real fabric underpinning our democracy is tested, but also where, we have an opportunity to look back and understand our history and founding documents as a guide to today and to the future, and ensuring that this is a country that remains, a shining beacon across the world, is unique in the history of governance and in safety and security and prosperity. So, this is a newspaper that lives and breathes America, and, everything about its coverage will reflect the same. Our famous editor, Charles Dana, who edited The Sun in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, is one of the most famous journalists in the history, or editors in history of American journalism, says, an American who thinks another country is better than this one should not go into journalism. And that's definitely a fundamental pillar of the New York Sun as well.
So you mentioned earlier that the Sun doesn't necessarily subscribe to a particular political party. So has the Sun ever endorsed a particular candidate, or do they kind of stay out of that realm?
Yeah, the Sun definitely endorses candidates. I think the point is that the Sun's perspective is not through the lens of politics or, personalities or parties. It's through the lens of principle. Having said that, that doesn't mean that it won't hold strong opinions. And, it will endorse and back the candidates that it feels are best representative of its particular principles and the principles that it espouses. So, I can share a little bit about those perspectives, but, there are, traditional, a special appreciation for, individual liberties, private enterprise, the rights of individuals, equality under the law, sound money, certainly in opposition to communism and populism and socialism and, robust, I would say, foreign policy and an appreciation for America's role in the world. So the Sun is certainly a principal newspaper. It's a newspaper that has a strong worldview and a perspective, but it always goes back to the point of, what are our principles and ideals, and how does this individual politician or this political party or statement reflect or impact those ideals, as opposed to, what can I do to advance this or that political agenda, which, unfortunately we see as the guiding light of a lot of news publications today. That's not the Sun.
And what would be your strategy for long-term growth of the New York Sun?
Well, the strategy for long-term growth of the Sun focuses a lot on audience building, specifically online, reaching those individuals or those Americans that are frustrated by the news that we have today, or like the lack of journalistic integrity, and ensuring that, using advanced digital strategies online. Certainly there's an approach that involves social media and, a whole host of other digital opportunities to reach and build audiences, specific audiences, and ensure that we can get the Sun in front of them and invite them to participate and be a part of it.
And how can people actually get the Sun in front of them? Where can they go to read the Sun or to even subscribe to it?
I'm glad that you asked. That's easy. nysun.com, www.nysun.com. You'll be greeted with a beautiful new landing page, homepage, and see a little taste of what the Sun has to offer. You'll probably get a little pop-up over there that asks you for your email. Encourage you to put your email in there, subscribe, and you'll start to receive the Sun twice daily. On weekdays, the morning Sun in the mornings, and the evening Sun in the evenings, and then on weekends, the weekend Sun. You'll start to see and appreciate and engage with the Sun's journalism, and hopefully you'll say yes to an opportunity to subscribe and become a part of the Sun's community. If you're not happy with what's out there, if you're frustrated by the journalism you see all around you, then the New York Sun is for you. Welcome, and help us build a better journalism.
And if you had to leave our audience with one final thought about the importance of newspapers and what sets the New York Sun apart from all the other newspapers out there, what would that be?
Well, the fundamental principle in order for newspapers to be effective is that they must never forget their primary role to be an advocate and to serve the public, the American public, and to build that trust with the reader. Unfortunately, there's an incredible breakdown of that trust. It's really an epidemic in our country today. The New York Sun is a newspaper you can trust, and a newspaper that has the back of the American public. It's a newspaper that shines for all. And if you're frustrated with what you see out there in the other newspapers and the journalism that exists today, then the Sun is really for you. Give it a try. We'll welcome you with open arms.
Well, we would certainly like to thank our guest today, publisher and chairman of the New York Sun, Dovid Efune. Thank you for coming on our show today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.